playing a crazy game here with the atmosphere and the oceans. We're taking vast amounts of carbon from deep underground and putting this in the atmosphere. This is crazy. We should not do this. It's very dangerous. So we should accelerate the transition to sustainable energy. I mean, the bizarre thing is that obviously we're going to run out of oil in the long term. You know, there's only so much oil we can mine and burn. It's tautological. We must have a sustainable energy transport and energy infrastructure in the long term. So we know that's the end point. We know that. So why run this crazy experiment where we take trillions of tons of carbon from underground and put it in the atmosphere and oceans? This is an insane experiment. It's the dumbest experiment in human history. Why are we doing this? It's crazy.
All right, so how do you feel about that?
It was a bit odd. The way he was talking, as if, you know, it was some sort of experiment when it's evolved over time. As humans have evolved, we've started producing electricity as things were invented in the use of fossil fuels. Nobody knew at the time that it was going to have such an impact on the environment. So he's kind of like Monday morning quarterbacking, where he's saying, I can't believe we're doing this. What an experiment. Well, we didn't know that. Now we know that there's adverse effects from what we're doing. And he's talking about sustainability. Well, some of his ideas of sustainability are not really the greatest. So one has to wonder, is a lot of the things he's talking about to put money in his pocket? Because a lot of the stuff that he owns, you know, Tesla, battery cells, in theory, it doesn't produce carbon emissions, but in order to produce the product, it has a lot of adverse effects. I'm always hearing about this sustainability, that we're going to run out of fossil fuels. There's a tremendous amount of fossil fuels still available to us and will continue to be for a very long time. So this whole thing about sustainability is accurate, but not as dire as people are saying it is. Everybody wants to use electricity, but nobody wants to take into consideration that there is a downfall of using electricity that relates to the environment. There's no real easy, simple way to use electricity and not have some sort of adverse effect. Everybody has their ideas, and as technology advances, we're coming up with better ways of doing that. But at the end of the day, there's going to be some give and take. If you're really committed, then stop using electricity. But how many people would really do that? It's one thing to say it, they don't want the impact on the environment, but do they really want to take that step and give up their iPhone and electronic devices? I don't think so. I know this is going to be a very unpopular opinion, but everybody keeps saying that causing all this damage to the environment, possibly, but we've only been recording temperatures for a few hundred years. We've raised the temperature roughly 2 degrees over 200 years. Now, have we? Or is this the natural progression? Or did we maybe speed this up? But it's inevitable. We know that the Earth changes temperature. We know it has ice ages. We know we've had dawn of the dinosaurs is very hot. So are we really doing that? And a lot of people don't take into consideration. Everybody wants to blame fossil fuel burning equipment. But science has proven that the biggest contributor to greenhouse gases are animals, cows. So even if this wasn't invented and we weren't doing the stuff we're doing, would we have really changed the environment as much as everybody's saying? I'm not saying it's false data, but one has to question that. And if that is true, there are ways of making electricity with minimum impact. I think there'll always be some type of impact, but there is ways of capturing emissions through emissions control equipment, carbon capture and different things. So there are ways of burning fossil fuels very clean, but there's always going to be some sort of adverse effect, just like with batteries. You know, you'd have a car that runs off of batteries. Yes, there's no emissions coming out of that vehicle at that time, but you still have to burn some type of fossil fuel in order to power that battery. Any type of power plant, that any type of what's called emissions, any visible emissions, which is opacity, would result in an instant fine to a power plant, they'd be shut down, fined, and they make the paper. So it'd be a big deal. So power plants are not just sitting there smoking along. That doesn't happen.
Because we have now put a lot of provisions in place to make sure that power plants have clean air and that we're not.
And the DEP, Department of Environmental Protection, oversees it. So every power plant has to send in monthly reports off their calibrated system of their emissions. And if they violate, they actually have an air permit they have to follow very closely. And if they don't, they get fined.
So power plants are not as bad as everybody thinks.
No. They all have a agreed upon a permit that they have to stick to.
And basically, without power plants, we would not be able to generate any power to live off of.
That's correct. And basically, anybody that enjoys using electricity really doesn't have a leg to stand on.
That's one thing that you could say would be helpful to clean air for people to basically contribute to.
Basically, pollution control equipment. Basically, in a power plant, it's like a catalytic converter on your car. It cleans the emissions before it goes into the atmosphere. I could spend days going over all the different types of equipment, but in essence, they're scrubbers. And they clean what they call exhaust gas before it goes into the atmosphere.
So if everybody's just kind of aware of, and this is separate from the ocean and, going green and saving the turtles. This is completely separate, right? That's not what we're talking about.
This is just straight air.
Okay, awesome. So how can we find you for more information?
Just click that button below. Follow Engineer Eric Explains.